creating and working with a Vue events database? Well, I don't know. Every one of these CBT series has always have one or sometimes two of these nuggets that you're like, oh, why bother? And a lot of times they're the short ones. This one's going to be relatively short. The Vue events database in VMware Vue is one of those, why would they make this as a separate installation sort of questions when you think about it from VMware's perspective? So I have to ask the question first and sort of answer it as well. Why an event database? I mean, if you are in any kind of organization that has auditors or any security model or the desire just to know what the heck is going on inside of your desktop delivery infrastructure, well, an event database is probably a useful thing for you. Okay, that it can help you track down what's gone wrong, or it can help your auditors track down that nothing has gone wrong. It can help you identify if there are certain situations going on. I mean, the event database, just like in Windows, is useful for a variety of purposes. Now, the reason why an event database, or the likely reason why an event database is a separate installation in Vue, is because if you think about back in that Vue connection server installation, installing Vue connection server does not require any kind of database, right? We didn't actually have to start talking a SQL until we started installing Vue Composer. And so it's entirely possible that in a composerless world that you've never really had to touch SQL, with the single exception of for running your vCenter farm, your vSphere farm. So it makes sense when you think about the installation kind of path that we've taken to get here, why this is a separate install, why this is a separate activity. So with that said, in this nugget, I want to spend pretty much the entirety of this relatively short nugget talking about how to configure that event database. It's not terribly difficult. We've kind of done this already in the creation of the Vue Composer database. And then once we've configured that database on the SQL side, we'll do a little bit of work over on the VMware Vue side. That will initiate the connection between Vue Connection Server and the event database. And then we'll take a look at a few of the event database entries, just so you can see, well, what kind of objects, what kind of activities is this event database actually capturing. So let me go ahead and minimize this. Here we are back in VMware Vue Administrator, taking a look at the linked clones pool. I've removed some of the dedicated pools out of here just to make things simpler from now on. Those were removed after the Vue Transfer Server nugget, the last one. Now down here at the bottom under Vue Configuration, you'll see this event configuration item. We skipped over this before. Okay, and now we're going to actually take a look at how to create and connect to that event database. You can see here in this item. So here's the event database. I've got to provide a database server, and then potentially some other stuff that'll be necessary in order to connect up to that database server. What I have to do before I even get this far is to go over to wherever my SQL database actually exists. Now in this environment, now the database exists here in the vCenter server. And I'm not terribly interested in taking a look at the vSphere client right now. What I'm instead interested in looking at are two items associated with SQL Server Management. The first is the SQL Server Configuration Manager, and the second will be the SQL Server Management Studio. I'll just get that launched so it's available for us here in just a minute. If I go up here to SQL Server 2008 R2 and take a look at configuration tools, what I'm looking for first is the SQL Server Configuration Manager. If you've played with SQL, if you've ever installed SQL before, you've probably used this little tool in the past. Anytime you have a database that you're connecting to via the application on the same server as the database, well, generally it's only necessary to install or to enable the shared memory protocol. Okay, the application can talk to the database without having to go over the network. Well, when I have remote applications that are attempting to come in and interact with this database, well, I need to turn on some of the other protocols. And in this case, the TCP/IP protocol is the one that Vue uses to connect from the connection server over here to the configuration, or over here to the SQL database. So make sure that this TCP/IP protocol is enabled here in SQL Server Configuration Manager. And then once you're done with that, we can take a look at the SQL Server Management Studio. Okay, just like before, we're going to log onto the SQL Server Management Studio. And the first thing we have to do is to simply create a database. I'm going to right-click and choose New Database here. I'm going to paste in a database name, or maybe I'm not, Vue Events, EVENTS, database. I'll copy that to the clipboard, make things easier for later. Just like before, also change the recovery model over here to simple, and click the OK button to create the database. all of the database schema is going to get created for us once this database is initially created. So just like before, all we have to do is create the database and then also create the database user that will be associated with that database. So here's the View Events Database user. Like all the VMware View tools, the events database has to run with SQL Server authentication. So I'm going to switch this down to SQL Server authentication, put in my username and password, disable the password policy just to make things easy, and then change to the View Events database. That's the default database for this user. The last step here is under user mapping to select the database, the View Events database, and then make this user DB_owner. Same process as before. Same process as creating that View Composer database. Right now, we have everything set up here on the SQL Server side, so that back here on the VMware View Connection Server side, we can then make that connection between, connection server and its database. So the database server is vc.company.pri, and the database type is going to be Microsoft SQL Server. You'll notice that SQL Server here will automatically give me the port information, which by default is port 1433. Need to punch in the database name, View Events Database, and the user, as well as their password. And confirm the password. And that takes us down here to the bottom item, which is the table prefix. Of all of the items in here, this is probably the only one that might give you a little bit of confusion. A single View Events database has the capacity for collecting data, for collecting event information across multiple different View installations. And so since it can actually collect data for those multiple View installations, we want to include some kind of table prefix that identifies which installation these entries relate to. So I can put this in as anything I want. I'll just put VE underscore as the table prefix to recognize that this is my View Events database for my primary View installation. You'll want to, make sure that these are unique for the different installations that you have. Once I'm done, I hit the OK button. And if everything goes well, then you'll see that I have a successful connection here between the connection server and my View Events database. I can later go back and edit those settings if I want. I'm probably not going to do this unless I need to, for example, change the table prefix or perhaps change the password. Down here in the bottom are a few event settings that identify how long I want to keep data for. Now you'll notice that View Administrator can show up to 2,000 events from the time period specified below, and older events get archived off into database historical tables. The idea here is that if I have a list of the current events, that will allow me to filter just based on what's been happening in the now. Anything else for archival or for audit purposes can get sent off into historical tables inside the database. So this gives me the ability to show events in View Administrator for a certain number of months, and then classify those events as new if they've been around for a certain number of days. Once I've got that and I hit OK, again, that completes the installation of the View Events database. With this database in place, the way in which we go about identifying what's going on with the database happens in multiple locations. So for example, if I'm taking a look at the linked clones pool here, if you recall, when we were working with the linked clones pool, there was this events tab that gave us information about what's going on with that pool of virtual machines. Now, if we click over here to the events database, this will give us any of the event information or the event entries that appear in the database over a specific period of time. So let's say, for example, I change a policy here. And I change the multimedia redirection policy to allow multimedia redirection. Well, this, as you can imagine, might be considered to be an event in the database. And so you can see that we now have an audit event with a success showing that the user G Shields has actually made some sort of change to the configuration of View. You'll see here that this is the information that got changed. In fact, that the pool linked clones policy was updated. And the modification was to allow MMR equal to true. I can click this button here to see what associated objects are relevant for this event database entry. So again, not that much here to see. The idea is that the events database presents a mechanism for you to understand who has been performing what activities and what sorts of behaviors are going on inside of your View infrastructure. So what have we talked about this now? We've talked about, why an event database, and then how associated with an events database. We discussed why an events database is important, why you might want to have one in your infrastructure, and then we went through some basic installation and configuration items that are required to get the whole thing set up. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.